Captain Jordan Davis strode through the airport, moving with the calm confidence that came from years of experience in the skies. At his side walked his son, Liam, a young boy with an eager gaze, drinking in the sights and sounds of the bustling terminal around them. Liam looked up to his dad with unmistakable admiration. After all, not every kid had a father who could fly planes. And today was special. It was one of those rare occasions when Liam got to accompany his dad to work. Captain Davis had flown hundreds, maybe thousands of flights. He was the kind of pilot who knew every inch of an aircraft, every detail about his route, and every protocol. There was a quiet pride in his stride, a knowledge that he had earned the respect of his crew and passengers through years of service and dedication. But today was different. He was not just Captain Davis, the experienced pilot. He was also Dad. And to him, nothing was more important than this special time with Liam, his only child. For Liam, today was meant to be an adventure. He had always been fascinated by the world of aviation, listening with wide eyes whenever his father shared stories from his flights. Liam dreamed of sitting in the cockpit next to his dad, watching the controls, hearing the flight announcements, and feeling the power of the plane as it lifted off the ground. Normally, when he traveled with his father, he'd get a small peek into this world, a chance to see his dad in action, and maybe even watch a few minutes of the flight from the cockpit. But today, something was different. Captain Davis had explained the change that morning, with a smile and a gentle pat on his son's shoulder. "Today you'll be sitting with the other passengers, Liam," he'd said, noticing the puzzled look on his son's face. "It'll be a new experience. You'll get to see what it's like from the cabin. Maybe you'll even enjoy it." Liam tried to hide his disappointment. Sitting with the passengers. That sounded like a far cry from his usual co-pilot seat right next to his dad, where he could watch every switch flicked and every button pressed. But his father had a way of making any situation sound like an adventure, and Liam was determined to make the most of it. He trusted his dad, who had never led him astray before. So, hand in hand, they walked through the terminal together, weaving between travelers who rushed to catch their flights or waited patiently by the gates. Captain Davis pointed out the various types of aircraft as they passed the massive windows, giving Liam bits of trivia about each one. Liam listened intently, nodding and asking questions, his excitement building despite the change in plans. The two of them shared an unspoken bond, the kind that didn't need words to express the love and trust they had for one another. Captain Davis was not only Liam's hero, but his guide to a world beyond the clouds, a world that Liam longed to be a part of. And for Captain Davis, sharing these rare moments with his son was a cherished gift, something he didn't take for granted. As they approached the gate, Captain Davis knelt down to Liam's level. He adjusted the boy's backpack, made sure his ticket was secure in his pocket, and gave him a reassuring smile. "All right, Liam," he said softly, "you know the drill. Stick to your seat, and don't forget, I'll be right there in the cockpit, keeping an eye on things." Liam nodded, holding back a grin. "I know, Dad. I'll be fine." There was a hint of excitement in his voice, but also a touch of nervousness. Sitting alone in the cabin would be a different experience, and he wasn't entirely sure what to expect. But he trusted his dad, and that was all that mattered. Captain Davis gave him a final nod, then straightened up, glancing around to make sure everything was in order. Passengers were starting to gather, and a few had noticed him, recognizing him as the pilot. There were nods of acknowledgement, a few polite smiles, and Captain Davis returned each one with a calm, confident look. He was used to this kind of attention, and it didn't faze him. Finally, it was time for them to board. Captain Davis watched as Liam handed his ticket to the attendant at the gate, who smiled kindly at him. Liam's eyes sparkled with excitement, and his father felt a surge of pride. This was his son, eager, curious, and unafraid of new experiences. He was growing up so fast, and moments like these reminded Captain Davis of just how precious time with his son truly was. They walked down the jet bridge together, But at the door of the plane, they would part ways. Captain Davis had to head to the cockpit, and Liam would take his seat among the passengers. Captain Davis gave his son a quick, reassuring hug before guiding him toward the cabin with a gentle pat on the back. "Enjoy the flight, son. I'll see you when we land," he said with a wink. Liam took a deep breath, nodded, and walked down the aisle, looking around at the rows of seats, the passengers settling in, and the hum of activity as flight attendants prepared for takeoff. He found his seat near the middle of the cabin, stowed his backpack under the seat in front of him, and glanced around, taking in the unfamiliar perspective. This was his dad's world, but from a whole new angle. It felt strange and exciting all at once. The other passengers around him seemed oblivious to this connection to the man in the cockpit. To them, he was just another young boy on a plane, maybe even traveling alone. They didn't know that his father was the one responsible for getting them safely to their destination, guiding the massive aircraft through the clouds. Liam was used to the respect his father commanded in his role as a pilot, but here he was just one of the passengers, blending into the crowd. And that's where the trouble began. As Liam settled into his seat, he noticed a flight attendant approaching. She seemed focused, glancing around as if assessing the passengers. When her eyes landed on Liam, there was a slight pause, a look of surprise, and perhaps even a hint of suspicion. She walked over, her expression cool and slightly stern. "Excuse me, young man," she said, her voice polite, but with an underlying tone of authority. "Are you sure you're in the right seat?" Liam looked up, slightly taken aback. He nodded and showed her his ticket, hoping to clear up any confusion. "Yes, this is my seat," he replied, his voice steady. The flight attendant studied him for a moment longer, then gave a slight nod, but her eyes still held a glimmer of doubt. "All right, just checking," she said before moving on. Liam felt a slight twinge of discomfort. He was used to being treated warmly by his father's crew whenever he flew with him. This interaction felt different, like he was being scrutinized rather than welcomed. A few minutes later, another flight attendant passed by, casting a curious glance in his direction. Liam tried to ignore it, focusing instead on the safety instructions playing on the screen in front of him. He knew them all by heart. His dad had taught him everything about plane safety, but something about being treated like an ordinary passenger made him feel oddly out of place. He glanced around the cabin, noticing the diverse group of passengers settling in for the flight. Some were engrossed in their books, others chatting quietly with their neighbors. Liam felt like he was in a strange in-between space, connected to the pilot up front but invisible to everyone else. It was a feeling he hadn't experienced before, a mix of anonymity and belonging that was both unsettling and intriguing. Little did he know, this was just the beginning. What started as a simple flight with his father would soon take a surprising turn, revealing unexpected truths and testing the bond between father and son in ways he couldn't yet imagine. As Liam settled into his seat, he started to notice that this flight wasn't like the others he had taken with his dad. Usually, whenever he flew, people were friendly. The crew would greet him with warm smiles, especially when they found out he was Captain Davis's son. Sometimes, the crew would even go out of their way to bring him a snack or let him peek into the cockpit for a few minutes before takeoff. But today, everything felt different. Sitting alone among the other passengers, Liam tried to stay calm and excited for the journey ahead. He knew his dad was just a few rows away in the cockpit, getting ready to fly the plane. That thought made him feel safe, even if things felt a little strange in the cabin. But then he noticed something unusual. A flight attendant, a tall woman with dark hair pulled back into a neat bun, kept glancing in his direction. Every time she passed by his row, her eyes seemed to linger on him for a moment longer than on anyone else. At first, Liam brushed it off, assuming she was just being careful. But soon, her gaze turned from simply watchful to something colder, something he wasn't used to. He started feeling uncomfortable, like he was doing something wrong just by sitting there. Liam's quiet demeanor might have made him seem shy or uncertain to someone who didn't know him, But in reality, he was a calm and polite boy. He had learned from his dad to always stay respectful, especially around adults, and to be confident but humble. Today, though, he couldn't shake the feeling that the staff was looking at him with suspicion rather than friendliness. The flight attendant with the dark bun finally stopped by his seat. She had a stern expression, her brow slightly furrowed as she looked down at him. "Excuse me, young man," she said, her voice polite, but edged with a hint of doubt. "Are you sure this is your assigned seat?" Liam nodded, pulling his ticket from his pocket and holding it up for her to see. "Yes, this is my seat," he replied, doing his best to stay respectful. She glanced at the ticket, her eyes scanning it quickly, then handed it back without much of a change in her expression. "All right then," she said, her voice stiff and formal. "Just checking." But as she walked away, Liam noticed her shaking her head slightly, as if she didn't quite believe him. He looked around, wondering if anyone else had noticed the exchange, but everyone else seemed busy settling in, adjusting their bags or reading magazines. Liam took a deep breath, telling himself to stay calm. It was just a misunderstanding, he thought. She probably thought he was traveling alone, and was just checking to make sure everything was okay. But not long after, another flight attendant walked down the aisle, casting a quick, curious glance in his direction. Liam was starting to feel more self-conscious. He didn't know why they seemed so interested in him. He was just a kid, waiting for the flight to begin. Didn't they have other passengers to check on? Liam's discomfort grew as he noticed a few other flight attendants whispering to each other, their eyes occasionally darting in his direction. He felt a prickling sensation on the back of his neck, like he was being watched too closely. It was a feeling he didn't like, and it made him wish he could tell his dad what was happening. But he didn't want to cause any trouble. He was proud of his dad's job and didn't want to make things awkward for him. Then the lead flight attendant, a woman named Carla, approached him. She looked down at him with a raised eyebrow, a skeptical look on her face. Carla was tall, with short blonde hair, and her sharp professional appearance made her seem strict and unyielding. She was clearly in charge, and her expression didn't show even a hint of friendliness. "Is this really your seat?" she asked, her tone direct and almost challenging, as if she already knew the answer and was expecting him to lie. "Yes, it is," Liam replied, his voice calm but slightly nervous. "My dad is the pilot." Carla's eyebrows shot up, and for a moment, there was a flash of surprise on her face. But instead of softening, her expression grew more condescending. She let out a short, dismissive chuckle, shaking her head slightly. "Let's not play games, all right?" she said, leaning in closer. Her voice was low, but there was a hardness in it that made Liam's cheeks flush. "Stay put and don't make trouble." Liam felt his face grow hot with embarrassment and frustration. He wanted to explain, to tell her that he wasn't lying, that his dad really was the pilot of this flight. But something in Carla's tone told him that she wouldn't believe him no matter what he said. She had already decided that he was just a kid trying to cause trouble, and nothing he said would change her mind. Trying to keep his frustration in check, Liam nodded and looked down, hoping that would be the end of it. Carla gave him one last look, her eyes narrowing slightly, before turning and walking back down the aisle. Liam watched her go, feeling a mix of anger and confusion. He had never been treated like this before, and he didn't understand why it was happening now. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, glancing around to see if anyone else had noticed the interaction. But everyone else seemed focused on their own things, oblivious to what had just happened. Liam sighed, trying to focus on something else to distract himself. But the feeling of being singled out, of being misunderstood, lingered in the back of his mind, making it hard to relax. As the minutes passed, Liam tried to shake off the feeling of unease, reminding himself that his dad was close by, just in the cockpit, preparing for the flight. He imagined his father's calm, reassuring face, and felt a small sense of comfort. His dad would know what to say in a situation like this, but Liam wasn't sure he wanted to bother him. Captain Davis had enough on his plate, and Liam didn't want to add to his worries. However, as more crew members passed by his row, Liam couldn't ignore the glances they kept throwing his way. Some looked confused, others seemed slightly annoyed. It was as if they couldn't decide whether he was in the wrong seat, up to some mischief, or simply out of place. At one point, Carla walked past him again, her gaze lingering as she adjusted a bag in the overhead bin. She didn't say anything this time, but her eyes seemed to communicate a clear message: "I'm watching you." Liam felt another wave of frustration, but forced himself to remain still and keep quiet. He was determined not to cause any trouble, even if they seemed intent on treating him like he already had. He thought about speaking up, about explaining who his dad was and why he was on this flight. Maybe if they knew his dad was the pilot, they would stop looking at him like he didn't belong here. But every time he thought about saying something, he remembered Carla's cold, dismissive tone and felt his resolve weaken. She hadn't believed him the first time, and he doubted she would listen if he tried again. The plane's boarding was almost complete, and passengers around him were beginning to settle in. Liam shifted in his seat, feeling like he was caught in some strange misunderstanding that he didn't know how to fix. Part of him wanted to stand up and call for his dad, to have him come back and clear things up once and for all. But another part of him didn't want to bother his father, especially when he knew how much responsibility Captain Davis had to handle before takeoff. As he sat there, his hands clenched tightly in his lap, Liam could feel the frustration building inside him. He was just a kid trying to enjoy a flight with his dad, but the crew's suspicious looks and Carla's harsh tone were turning what should have been a fun adventure into something uncomfortable and upsetting. He couldn't understand why they were treating him like this. He wasn't causing any trouble. He was just sitting in his assigned seat, waiting for the plane to take off like everyone else. Liam took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. His dad had always taught him to be patient, to stay calm in difficult situations. He remembered his father's voice, reminding him that sometimes people make mistakes or misjudge others, and that it was best to respond with kindness and understanding. But today, sitting alone in that seat with suspicious eyes watching him, it was hard to follow that advice. Just when Liam thought things couldn't get any worse, Carla returned, this time with another flight attendant in tow. They both stopped by his seat, and Carla gave him a look that was both stern and skeptical. "We just want to make sure everything is okay here," she said, folding her arms across her chest. "Are you sure you're supposed to be here alone?" Liam felt a wave of frustration rise up again, but he kept his voice steady as he replied, "Yes, I'm supposed to be here. My dad is the pilot." The second flight attendant exchanged a glance with Carla, her expression filled with doubt. It was clear they didn't believe him, and their skepticism only made him feel more isolated. "All right," Carla said after a moment, her voice dripping with disbelief. "Just stay in your seat and don't cause any problems." With that, they walked away, leaving Liam feeling frustrated, humiliated, and completely misunderstood. Minutes passed by slowly for Liam, who sat quietly in his seat, trying his best to ignore the cold glances that Carla and the other attendants occasionally threw his way. He knew that something about him seemed to bother them, though he couldn't quite understand what he had done to deserve such treatment. All he wanted was a peaceful flight, an adventure in the skies, knowing his dad was in the cockpit up front, leading this journey. Yet, instead of enjoying the ride, Liam felt trapped under a cloud of judgment and doubt. Carla seemed to be the main source of his discomfort. Her gaze would settle on him every now and then, her expression filled with irritation and suspicion. Liam wasn't sure if she thought he was up to some sort of mischief or if she just didn't like that he was sitting there alone. Whatever the reason, her attention was unsettling, and it made him feel small and unwelcome. He could feel her looking at him every few minutes, as if she was just waiting for him to do something wrong. Trying to stay calm, Liam reminded himself of his dad's words before they boarded. His father had always taught him to stay composed, to hold his head high, and to be respectful, no matter how others treated him. "Remember, Liam," his dad would say, "not everyone will understand you. But that doesn't mean you should change who you are." Those words echoed in his mind as he sat there, determined not to let Carla's cold glances shake him. Just when he thought he could finally relax, he felt a shadow fall over him. He looked up to see Carla standing in the aisle beside him, her arms crossed and her gaze hard and unyielding. She looked at him as if he were an inconvenience, like he was sitting somewhere he didn't belong. "We need to make some adjustments with seating," she said abruptly, not even attempting a polite tone. "You're going to move to another seat." Liam blinked, caught off guard. "But this is my assigned seat," he said softly, holding up his ticket. Carla barely glanced at it before shaking her head, a hint of annoyance crossing her face. "That may be, but we need this seat for someone else. You'll be just fine in another spot." Without waiting for his response, she motioned for him to stand up, her tone leaving no room for argument. Liam felt a flash of frustration, but he swallowed it down, rising from his seat slowly. He knew it wasn't worth causing a scene, and besides, his dad would want him to handle the situation with patience. So he picked up his bag and followed Carla a few rows back, where she pointed to a seat that was closer to the back of the plane, cramped and isolated. As Liam settled into his new spot, he noticed that this seat didn't recline, and it was positioned right beside the restroom, with a constant stream of people walking past. It wasn't nearly as comfortable as his original seat, and he couldn't help but feel like he'd been pushed aside, as if he didn't matter. But instead of letting it upset him, he reminded himself of his dad's calm strength. He sat up straight, took a deep breath, and resolved to stay quiet. While Liam tried to get comfortable in his new seat, he couldn't help but notice Carla continuing to fuss over the other passengers. She moved briskly up and down the aisle, checking on people, smiling at some, and offering drinks and snacks with a friendly tone that she hadn't shown him. It was strange to see the difference in her behavior. She seemed genuinely warm with the other passengers, while with him, she had been nothing but cold. Liam watched her, observing the way she treated everyone else with courtesy and respect, and he couldn't help but feel a little hurt. But instead of letting the frustration bubble over, he reminded himself of something his dad had once told him. Sometimes, people judge others without even realizing it. They see what they want to see, not what's really there. Liam held on to those words, realizing that maybe Carla's attitude wasn't really about him at all. Perhaps she simply didn't understand who he was. As he sat there, quietly observing, he noticed more little details about the way Carla and the crew operated. He watched as she and the other attendants moved through the cabin, noting their routines, the way they interacted with passengers, and the expressions they wore. He had always been a sharp observer, something his dad had noticed early on and encouraged. Liam had a knack for picking up on small details, and though he was just a kid, he had a sense for understanding people and situations. A few more minutes passed, and Liam did his best to stay occupied, glancing out the window and trying to enjoy the view. But then, he saw Carla coming down the aisle again, her eyes scanning the rows. When she looked in his direction, her expression turned almost impatient, as if she were annoyed just by seeing him sitting there. "Are you all right?" she asked, her tone flat, almost disinterested. "Yes, I'm fine," Liam replied politely, though he could sense that she didn't really care about his answer. "Good," she said shortly, moving on without another word. But as she walked away, he saw her roll her eyes slightly, a small gesture that spoke volumes. It was clear that she didn't want him there. And it stung, but Liam didn't let it show. Instead, he simply took a deep breath and turned back to the window, finding comfort in the steady hum of the plane's engines. In that moment, Liam remembered a story his dad had once told him about his own early days as a pilot. He had shared how some people had doubted him too, back when he was just starting out. "It wasn't always easy," his dad had said, "but I knew what I was capable of, and that's what mattered." Liam clung to that story now, reminding himself that he too could stay strong, even when others didn't see him for who he really was. As the flight continued, Liam noticed more little slights, subtle but unmistakable. Carla passed him several times, always with a look of irritation, and each time she did, it was as if she was silently telling him that he didn't belong. But instead of letting it bother him, Liam used those moments to remind himself of his dad's strength. He stayed calm, recording each small slight in his mind, knowing that his dad would be proud of him for handling the situation with patience. At one point, another flight attendant offered drinks to the passengers, stopping at each row with a polite smile. When she reached Liam, however, her smile faded slightly, and her tone became a bit more formal, almost distant. "Would you like something to drink?" she asked, her voice lacking the warmth she had shown to the other passengers. "Yes, please. May I have some water?" Liam replied, keeping his voice polite. She handed him a small cup of water without much of a response, then moved on quickly, barely giving him a second glance. Liam couldn't help but notice the difference, but he stayed quiet, choosing not to let it bother him too much. He took a sip of his water, focusing on the cool, refreshing taste and trying to let go of the frustration that was building inside. As the hours passed, Liam remained calm, though he couldn't shake the feeling of being out of place. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that he didn't need Carla's approval or anyone else's. He knew who he was, and he knew that his dad was up front, guiding the plane through the skies, just as he had done on countless other flights. That thought gave him strength, a quiet confidence that helped him rise above the discomfort. Watching Carla and the other attendants from his seat, Liam couldn't help but feel a small, ironic smile creeping onto his face. They had no idea who he really was or the strength he held inside. They saw only a quiet boy sitting in the back of the plane, someone they could overlook or dismiss. Little did they know that he was much more than that. He was the son of Captain Davis, a pilot who had overcome his own share of challenges and who had taught Liam to do the same. Liam sat there, holding on to his dad's lessons, feeling a sense of pride that the flight attendants couldn't take away from him. He didn't need to prove himself to them. In time, they would see the truth, just as others had seen his father's strength over the years. For now, he was content to wait, knowing that every second brought him closer to a moment of truth, a moment that would reveal who he truly was. As the flight continued, Carla made her way down the aisle once more, her gaze landing briefly on Liam before she moved on. Liam watched her go, his calmness masking a quiet strength that Carla hadn't noticed. He knew that she didn't see him for who he was, but he also knew that her opinion didn't define him. He was strong, resilient, and capable, just like his dad had taught him. And as he sat there, patient and calm, he couldn't help but think, if only she knew the truth. The flight had finally reached a steady cruising altitude, and Captain Davis felt a moment of relief as he completed his checklist. Everything was running smoothly in the cockpit, and he couldn't help but think of his son sitting in the back, probably looking out the window in awe or reading the book he packed. It wasn't often that Liam got to travel with him, and today felt like a small gift, a chance to share a part of his life with his son. But as he adjusted a few switches, a small thought lingered in his mind, a question he couldn't shake. Something had felt a bit off when he'd left Liam in his seat. Maybe it was the hesitant look on his son's face, or maybe it was just a father's instinct, but he had sensed a hint of unease in Liam. Captain Davis knew his son was mature and patient, but he also knew that people didn't always treat kids the way they deserved, especially kids like Liam, who had a quiet strength that people often misunderstood. Deciding to check in on his son, Captain Davis turned to his co-pilot. "Mind taking over for a few minutes?" he asked, his voice calm but purposeful. "Of course," the co-pilot replied with a nod, understanding that the captain just wanted a brief moment with his family. Captain Davis left the cockpit, making his way toward the back of the plane. As he stepped into the aisle, he was met with the usual calm hum of passengers reading, napping, and chatting quietly among themselves. He smiled at a few passengers who recognized him, nodding politely as he walked past. But when his eyes found Liam, his heart sank just a little. Liam wasn't in the comfortable seat he had originally been assigned. Instead, he was now sitting at the back of the plane, near the restroom, in a cramped seat that looked anything but comfortable. Captain Davis's brows furrowed as he took in the scene. His son's expression looked weary, but there was also a quiet resolve in his eyes, a look that told him Liam had been handling something on his own, perhaps a challenge he hadn't wanted to trouble his dad with. As Captain Davis approached, he noticed a figure standing a few rows up. Carla, the lead flight attendant, was watching Liam with a dismissive expression on her face, her arms folded tightly across her chest. She hadn't noticed the captain approaching yet, so focused was she on Liam. There was something almost cold in her stare, a look of annoyance as if Liam's very presence was somehow bothering her. Captain Davis stopped just a few feet behind her, close enough to hear her words. "Just stay seated and keep quiet," she was saying to Liam, her tone sharp and impatient. "We don't need any trouble from you. I've already had to move you once, so don't give me any more reason to do it again." Liam nodded quietly, his expression calm, though Captain Davis could see the tension in his son's posture. It was the kind of tension that only someone who knew Liam well could recognize. It was the look of someone trying hard to stay respectful even when they were being treated unfairly. Captain Davis felt a surge of protective anger rise within him, but he held it back, choosing instead to step forward calmly. He cleared his throat, and Carla turned around abruptly, her eyes widening slightly when she realized the captain was standing right there. "Captain Davis," she exclaimed, quickly adjusting her posture, trying to look composed. "Is there something you need?" Captain Davis's gaze shifted from Carla to Liam, who looked up at his dad with a mixture of relief and surprise. For a brief moment, he placed a reassuring hand on Liam's shoulder, offering his son a calm smile. Then he turned his attention back to Carla, his expression turning serious. "I was just coming to check on my son," he said, his voice steady but firm. "I couldn't help but notice he's been moved from his original seat. Care to explain why?" Carla's face paled, her confidence faltering as she took in the captain's words. For a moment, she looked genuinely taken aback, as if she couldn't quite process what he had just said. "By your son," she stammered, glancing from Liam to Captain Davis, a look of disbelief crossing her face. I didn't realize." Captain Davis's eyes narrowed slightly, his gaze unwavering. "Yes, my son, Liam. I assigned him a seat near the middle of the plane, but it seems he's been moved back here, to a much less comfortable spot. Would you mind explaining why that is?" Carla's mouth opened and closed a few times, her face turning red as she struggled to come up with an explanation. I didn't realize he was. That is, I didn't know he was your son," she managed to say, her voice wavering. Captain Davis raised an eyebrow, his expression calm but piercing. "So, you moved him because—" "Well, we had a seating issue," Carla stammered, trying to regain her composure. And I thought it would be best if he sat here instead." Captain Davis nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "I see. So you thought it was appropriate to move a young passenger, without a valid reason, from his assigned seat to a much less comfortable one. And then you chose to speak to him in a disrespectful tone." Carla's face flushed even more, and she shifted uncomfortably under his gaze. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. She seemed at a loss, unable to explain her actions in a way that wouldn't make her look even worse. Captain Davis glanced down at Liam, giving him a gentle smile. "Are you all right, son?" he asked softly, his voice filled with warmth and reassurance. Liam nodded, his eyes brightening at his father's presence. "Yes, Dad," he said quietly. "I'm okay." Captain Davis returned his gaze to Carla, his expression firm once more. "You see, Carla," he said, his tone calm but carrying an unmistakable authority. "My son is a passenger on this flight, just like everyone else. And as a passenger, He deserves to be treated with the same respect as anyone else on board. It seems you've overlooked that. Carla swallowed, her face paling as she realized the gravity of the situation. Captain, I apologize. I didn't realize. Captain Davis held up a hand, stopping her mid-sentence. It shouldn't matter who he is, whether he's my son or a stranger. He deserves the same respect. Moving him without reason and speaking to him in that tone was uncalled for. The passengers nearby, who had been observing the scene quietly, began to murmur among themselves. A few of them nodded in agreement, their expressions showing disapproval of Carla's actions. The atmosphere in the cabin had shifted, and it was clear that Carla could feel the weight of their judgment. She looked down, her hands twisting nervously. I understand, Captain. I didn't mean any harm. I thought. Captain Davis's voice softened slightly, but his tone remained firm. I'm sure you thought you were doing what was best, but respect should always come first. Remember that next time. Carla nodded, her face flushed with embarrassment and regret. Yes, sir. I'll remember that. Captain Davis gave a final nod before turning back to Liam. He knelt down to his son's level, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. Would you like to go back to your original seat, son? Liam hesitated for a moment, then shook his head. I'm fine here, Dad. Really? Captain Davis smiled, his pride evident. All right, but if you need anything, just let me know. I'll be right up front. Liam nodded, a small smile playing on his lips as he met his father's reassuring gaze. Captain Davis gave him a gentle squeeze on the shoulder, then stood up, giving Carla one last meaningful look before heading back to the cockpit. As he walked away, Carla remained rooted to the spot, her face pale and her expression shaken. She had underestimated Liam, seeing only a quiet boy and never considering that he might be connected to the captain. Now her actions were laid bare for everyone to see, and the respect she had lost couldn't easily be regained. From his seat, Liam watched his dad disappear back into the cockpit, feeling a surge of pride and gratitude. His father had stood up for him, making it clear that he mattered and deserved respect, no matter where he sat or who he was. The feeling of justice and validation washed over him, and he felt stronger, more assured than before. Carla, now aware of her mistake, seemed to avoid Liam's gaze for the rest of the flight, her usual confident stride subdued. Liam noticed, but he didn't dwell on it. Instead, he focused on the steady hum of the plane, the sight of clouds passing by outside the window, and the knowledge that his dad was just a few rows away, guiding them all safely to their destination. Little did Carla know that this moment of revelation was a lesson for her too, a reminder that respect should be given freely to all, because you never know who someone truly is. The plane continued on its course, but the atmosphere in the cabin had shifted. The whispers from nearby passengers, the sideways glances, and the murmurs of disapproval all painted a clear picture. Carla's actions toward Liam hadn't gone unnoticed, and the way Captain Davis had calmly, yet firmly, addressed the situation had left an impression on everyone watching. Liam felt a new sense of pride and comfort. He wasn't just the quiet boy in the back row anymore. He was Captain Davis's son, and he had a right to be respected just like everyone else. Sitting there, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. His father had stepped in, not just to defend him, but to remind everyone that every person deserved respect, no matter who they were. Meanwhile, Carla tried to go about her tasks, but the change in her demeanor was clear. Gone was the usual confidence in her step. Her movements were now slower, and she avoided meeting anyone's eyes, especially Liam's. She went through the motions of her job, but it was obvious that her thoughts were elsewhere. She had underestimated someone, dismissed them without cause, and now everyone knew it. As Captain Davis returned to the cockpit, he couldn't help but feel a sense of fulfillment. He hadn't raised his voice or made a scene. Instead, he had calmly shown Carla and everyone else that respect was a fundamental value on his flights. To him, being the captain wasn't just about flying a plane. It was about leading by example, creating an environment where everyone felt safe and respected. And today, he had reminded his crew of that in a way they wouldn't forget. The minutes passed slowly for Carla. She noticed the passengers still glancing at her, their expressions a mix of disapproval and quiet judgment. It was a strange feeling for her, being on the other side of judgment. She was usually the one in control, the one others looked to for guidance. But now, she felt vulnerable, as if a spotlight was shining on her every move. Unable to bear the tension any longer, Carla took a deep breath and approached the cockpit, knocking gently on the door. After a brief pause, Captain Davis's voice came through, inviting her in. She stepped inside, closing the door behind her, and took a moment to gather her thoughts before speaking. "Captain Davis," she began, her voice quiet and somewhat shaky. I wanted to apologize for my behavior earlier. I was out of line with your son, and I should have treated him with more respect." Captain Davis turned to face her, his expression calm but serious. He nodded, acknowledging her words, but he didn't let her off the hook just yet. "Thank you for coming to apologize, Carla," he said, his tone steady. "But respect isn't something that should be given only when someone's identity is revealed. It's something that should be shown to everyone, regardless of who they are or where they sit on this plane." Carla swallowed, nodding as she listened, feeling the weight of his words. "I understand, Captain. I made a mistake. I let my assumptions cloud my judgment, and that's not something I'm proud of." Captain Davis held her gaze, his eyes firm yet understanding. "We all make mistakes, Carla. But as part of this crew, I expect you to treat every passenger with kindness and respect, no matter their background, appearance, or demeanor. Liam is my son, yes, but even if he were a stranger, he would still deserve the same respect that every passenger on this flight deserves." Carla nodded again, her face flushed with embarrassment. "You're right, Captain. I will make sure this never happens again." Captain Davis gave her a small nod of approval. "Good. Use this as a learning experience. We're here to serve, not to judge. I trust that you'll remember that moving forward." Carla left the cockpit, her shoulders slightly slumped, but her expression resolute. She had learned an important lesson, one she wouldn't soon forget. As she returned to the cabin, she made a conscious effort to treat each passenger with a renewed sense of kindness and respect. The flight continued, and although the atmosphere was still a bit tense, it was clear that a change had taken place. Meanwhile, Liam sat quietly in his seat, feeling the mixture of relief and pride. He no longer felt like he had to prove himself to anyone on that plane. His dad had shown him, in the most powerful way, that he mattered, that he deserved respect, just as much as anyone else. As the flight neared its destination, Carla approached Liam, her expression softened, a hint of humility in her eyes. She knelt down to his level, taking a moment before speaking. "Liam," she began, her voice gentle, "I want to apologize for the way I treated you earlier. I made a mistake, and I was wrong to judge you without knowing you. I hope you can forgive me." Liam looked at her, taking in her sincere expression, and he nodded. "It's okay," he said quietly, his voice calm. "Thank you for saying sorry." Carla gave him a small smile, clearly relieved by his forgiveness. "You're a very mature young man, Liam. Your father must be very proud of you." Liam nodded again, a small smile appearing on his face. "Thank you." With that, Carla stood up and returned to her duties, but this time with a renewed sense of purpose. She knew that respect wasn't just something you gave when it was convenient. It was something that had to be shown to everyone, all the time. As the plane began its descent, the passengers prepared for landing, buckling their seatbelts and stowing their belongings. Liam looked out the window, watching as the landscape below grew closer, feeling a newfound sense of confidence. This flight had been a lesson for him too, a reminder that standing up for oneself, even in quiet ways, was important. And he knew that his dad would always be there to support him, no matter what. The plane touched down smoothly, And as they taxied to the gate, Liam felt a wave of excitement and pride. He couldn't wait to tell his dad how much he appreciated what he had done. Captain Davis had shown everyone that respect wasn't just a word. It was an action, something that had to be demonstrated, even when it wasn't easy. When the plane finally came to a stop and the seatbelt sign was turned off, Captain Davis emerged from the cockpit, making his way toward Liam. As he approached, he gave his son a warm smile, his eyes filled with pride. "How was the rest of the flight, champ?" he asked, ruffling Liam's hair. Liam grinned up at him. "It was good, Dad. Thank you for everything." Captain Davis smiled, nodding as he placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "You're welcome, son. I'm proud of you for handling things so well. You showed a lot of strength today." Passengers around them watched the exchange, some smiling, others nodding in quiet approval. It was clear that Captain Davis and Liam had left a lasting impression on everyone. And as they prepared to leave the plane, there was a newfound sense of respect in the air. As they walked down the aisle together, several passengers offered kind words to Captain Davis, acknowledging his handling of the situation. One woman leaned over and gave Liam a warm smile. "You've got a great dad," she said softly, and Liam nodded proudly. When they reached the exit, Carla stood by the door, waiting to bid farewell to each passenger. She looked at Captain Davis and Liam, her expression soft and humbled. She gave them a respectful nod as they passed, and Captain Davis returned it with a small nod of his own, a silent understanding passing between them. She had learned her lesson, and he hoped that it would stay with her long after this flight. As they stepped onto the jet bridge, Liam looked up at his father, a question in his eyes. "Dad, why did you stand up for me like that?" Captain Davis looked down at his son, his expression serious yet kind. "Because, Liam, everyone deserves respect, and sometimes people need a reminder of that. I wanted you to know that you matter, that you deserve to be treated well, just like everyone else. And if ever someone doesn't see that, you don't have to change who you are to please them." Liam nodded, understanding the lesson his father had imparted. It was a lesson he would carry with him, a reminder of the quiet strength that his dad had shown him today. They walked down the terminal together, side by side, feeling a sense of pride and unity that went beyond words. And as they disappeared into the crowd, it was clear that this flight had left a mark on everyone involved. A reminder that respect and fairness were values that should guide every interaction, both in the air and on the ground. Captain Davis had set a powerful example, and Liam had learned a lesson in resilience and self-worth that would stay with him for a lifetime. As Liam walked off the plane that day, he felt a sense of pride and strength that he had never experienced before. His father, Captain Davis, walked beside him, his calm and steady presence a reminder of the power of quiet strength. Liam realized that he had learned something important, something that went beyond just a lesson on kindness or fairness. He had learned about the true meaning of respect, the kind of respect that doesn't depend on titles, appearances, or assumptions. It's a respect that everyone deserves simply because they're human. He looked up at his dad, feeling a wave of gratitude. Captain Davis hadn't just stood up for him. He had shown Liam the importance of standing up for himself, of holding his head high even when others might not see his worth. Liam understood now that he didn't need to be loud or demanding to be strong. Sometimes, true strength meant staying calm, being patient, and allowing the truth to come out on its own. And sometimes, true courage was in choosing kindness, even when it wasn't easy. As they walked through the terminal, Liam noticed the way people looked at his father, with respect and admiration. They could see the kind of man he was, steady, fair, and unafraid to do what was right. Liam couldn't help but smile, realizing that he wanted to be just like his dad someday. Someone who didn't need to boast or demand respect, but who earned it by treating others well and standing up for what mattered. Carla's actions had been a painful reminder that people sometimes judge without knowing the full story. She had looked at Liam and made a quick decision based on what she saw on the surface. But Liam had learned from this experience that what others think of him doesn't define who he is. It's his own actions, his own choices, and his own values that make him who he is. This experience had also taught Carla a lesson, one that she would hopefully carry with her from that day forward. Respect wasn't about who held a certain position or who was connected to someone in charge. Respect was something that every person on that plane deserved, regardless of who they were. She had learned, through her own mistake, that treating others with dignity was not just a nice thing to do, it was the right thing to do. As they neared the baggage claim, Liam's thoughts drifted back to the moment his dad had calmly but firmly addressed Carla. His father's words had been gentle yet powerful, filled with the weight of someone who truly understood what respect and fairness meant. In that moment, Captain Davis had shown everyone on that plane, passengers and crew alike, that kindness and respect are the foundations of true strength. Liam's heart swelled with pride as he reflected on how his father hadn't tried to make Carla feel small or embarrassed. Instead, he had simply reminded her, and everyone else, that respect is a value we all must uphold, no matter who we're dealing with. And in doing so, Captain Davis had shown Liam that dignity isn't about having power over someone. It's about empowering others to be better, to be kinder, and to learn from their mistakes. Walking out of the terminal, Liam knew that he had gained something more valuable than just a lesson about respect. He had gained a sense of resilience, an understanding that he didn't have to let others' opinions shape his view of himself. He didn't need approval from everyone to feel strong or worthy. His own self-respect and the support of those who truly knew him were enough. Liam realized that the true lesson of the day wasn't just about standing up for himself. It was about understanding that real strength sometimes lies in patience, in quiet dignity, and in allowing others the chance to learn and grow. He knew that while it was important to stand up for what was right, it was equally important to do so with kindness and understanding, just as his dad had done. As they headed toward the exit, Captain Davis placed a gentle hand on Liam's shoulder, giving him a proud smile. "You did well today, son," he said, his voice filled with warmth. "You kept your head high, even when things were tough. That's what real strength is." Liam beamed up at his father, his heart full. "Thanks, Dad," he replied softly. "I learned a lot today." Captain Davis nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Remember, Liam, true strength doesn't always have to be loud. Sometimes it's the quiet strength, the strength to stay calm, to be patient, that makes the biggest difference." As they walked through the doors and into the fresh air outside, Liam held his head high, feeling the newfound sense of confidence. He knew that he was more than just the pilot's son. He was his own person, someone who deserved respect, not because of his connection to his father, but because he carried himself with dignity and kindness. He had learned to see his own worth, to value himself, even when others might not. And as for Carla, she had learned the hard way that respect isn't something you give only to those you think are important. Respect is something you show to everyone, because everyone has a story, and everyone deserves to be treated with dignity. Carla would remember this flight, not because of the mistakes she made, but because of the lesson she had learned. A lesson in humility, in kindness, and in seeing people for who they truly are. In the end, the experience had left an impact on everyone involved. It was a reminder that each of us has the power to choose respect, to treat others with kindness, and to stand up for what's right. Liam walked away with a sense of resilience that would stay with him forever, a strength that came from knowing who he was and knowing that he didn't need anyone's approval to feel worthy. That day, Liam discovered that true strength isn't just about standing up for yourself. It's about standing tall with dignity and patience, even when things are hard. It's about believing in your own worth, regardless of what others may think. And it's about knowing that sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one who holds the most power. With a renewed sense of purpose, Liam and his dad walked out of the airport, side by side. The experience had changed them both, reminding them of the values they held dear and the strength they found in each other. As they stepped into the world beyond, They carried with them a message of respect, dignity, and resilience, a message that would resonate with them for the rest of their lives.